evening, everybody, and welcome to Raising the Visibility. I am your host, Carl Evans, and it is my pleasure to have you all joining us on this wonderful Thursday evening. It's a little bit cold and cold and chilly where I am. This is only the second episode of Raising the Visibility. This is a show that we're hoping to make on a more regular basis, but it's something that's constructed for the network that I have built largely influenced around trying to explore different social and cultural intersections on mental health. And we don't have a set mold like some of our other excellent, amazing shows that are already on the network. This one's going to be a little more fluid in terms of the things that we cover. And today we're kind of doing a little bit of freewheeling today. This episode is really talking about sort of masks is going to be kind of a running theme. And I'll get into that in a minute, but just for those who are joining us, a little bit of housekeeping. We've got, as we're a young channel and a young network on Twitch, we're continuing to enhance and get better. We just hit our affiliate status a few weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago. So you can see we have things like bits you can get, and you can subscribe to us now. So if you have an opportunity, I would encourage you to consider following our page and subscribing. If you are an Amazon Prime member, you can actually get a free subscription. Amazon Prime is donating subscriptions to content creators like the Hope for Us Network on Twitch. And so if you look at the subscribe button, when you click on it, you'll actually see the option for Amazon Prime, and all you do is link in your accounts. And for the month or however many tiers you want to give us, you can actually donate a subscription to us that is covered on behalf of Amazon Prime. So that would be a great way to support the network as well as we continue to grow and build the organization and programming that we believe will help transform mental health principally in our communities and institutions. We're not even 180 days old as an organization, but as you may know if you've followed our websites and social media, the people who make the Hope for Us Network, we didn't just start this yesterday. We're a coalition of individuals who have come from a diverse range of backgrounds intersecting with mental health, from public education, private practice, clinicians, to social work, public advocates, volunteers, and most essentially lived experience individuals who have had to carry on the truth of their own mental health challenges into a world that is stigmatized and very much reactive to mental health. And the whole movement for the Hope for Us Network, of course, is working towards the proactive prevention concepts, where we can be disrupting the highest risk factors for mental health crisis early, before they escalate into a moment where it disrupts our lives and causes critical harm to our professional stability, our personal stability, and even risks the stability of our lives in general. Being proactive, however, isn't simply just remembering a series of signs and symptoms and tools. It's also sort of a mindset that we have to constantly train ourselves and focus on and discipline ourselves to embrace, because we grow up not prioritizing mental health. We grow up in societies that don't make information and resources visible on how to take care of our mental health. And more importantly, we function in societies, in communities that have institutions that are themselves somewhat dysfunctional in terms of being the best they could be for serving mental health. There's a lot of great and amazing people out there, from first responders to private practice to public institutions and community-oriented institutions, who are doing good and great work that is saving lives, work that is changing lives. But if you were to look at the entire nexus of mental health globally or nationally or in your own backyard, success you'll find is usually in spite of and not because of. And I would say that again, success, effective outcomes, healthy and safe outcomes when it comes to the resources available, it's usually a story of somebody was able to find tools and resources that saved their lives or impacted their lives positively in spite of the dysfunctions and inequities and inconsistencies in mental health services in mental health institutions, in the general knowledge base that we have. Being in an environment that is not supportive to your mental health can be harmful and lethal. And that environment can be your own home. That environment can be a school or workspace. That environment can just be a physical community space, whether it's a public library or you're hanging out at your local coffee shop. Hostility and stigma towards mental health breeds silence, and it breeds concealment. And if you think about your day-to-day life, the reality is that we all basically live in something that we call concealment culture. And we kind of are riffing on the concept of, if people sort of get cynical about cancel culture and words like that, but we actually like the term concealment culture because it's quite accurately a very real thing. Day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year, all of us, all of you, whether you live in an experience that will register as a diagnosable mental illness, or you're dealing with stressors in life that may not ever be able to match up the criteria, we're all concealing our thoughts, feelings, and emotions. And doesn't need to be a big speech why. We can all appreciate why we're doing that. We hide it because we don't want people to know. We don't want to be a burden. But even deeper than some of those reasons is that it's a matter of safety. We don't share how we truly are feeling because we don't trust that it's going to be received properly. And when I say we don't trust, that can mean that if we let people really know how we feel, that the result could be a risk to our job security. That if we let people really know how we're feeling, how we're struggling, how we're stressing, whether it's an anger or a sadness, whether it's an emptiness or a mute sort of, you can't put your word on how to describe it. Not telling someone, and when we talk about safety, it could be that it maintains a certain equilibrium in a relationship. And that can be a romantic relationship with an intimate partner. It could be your friend circle. It could be as parent or child, sibling, a sibling or son or daughter to a parent. Not letting other people know about your struggles can be a way that you think or can feel safe, can keep a sense of stability. Because if somebody did know, you could be treated differently. And differently could be anything from ostracized and made fun of to maybe it's a level of attention that you're worried about. Or maybe you think you're around people who just won't take you seriously. And that has its own brand of problems. When we talk about concealment culture, and you're going to hear that a lot at the network, we're talking about an environment that's shaped by stigmas. And if you spent any time around us, you're going to learn that, stigmas are social and cultural factors that try to dictate how we express ourselves. And we're going to say that a lot because you can hear it once and just think stigmas, it's a buzzword, it's a hashtag. All right, moving on. But it's a real tangible thing. And we're not just trying to belabor the point of saying stigma over and over again until you become numb to it. Being able to identify obstacles to communicating your mental health is the first step in us being able to move forward to building bridges to get appropriate help, to get effective treatment, to find resources that can help give you control and find a better for your mental health challenges. And so when we talk about stigmas, we want you to really pay attention to the idea of social and cultural factors that try to dictate how we express ourselves. Because when you're talking about mental health, all signs and symptoms are communicated through our thoughts, feelings, and emotions. In the same way that a physiological injury can be coughing, bleeding, a bruise, the equivalent of that for your mental health can be crying, it can be anger, but sometimes it can just be the verbal, I don't feel good. Because not every sort of mental challenge is just a one-to-one. Depression doesn't always look like someone crying in a corner. And if you are crying in a corner, that doesn't necessarily mean the only thing that's going on could be clinical depression. There's a lot of diagnoses that could be out there for you. You don't just fit in one little box. we express ourselves in such unique and different ways that thinking that diagnosis X, Y, or Z, having a psychological injury, oftentimes called a trauma, there's one set pattern of behavior you have to have. And we see this all the time. If you're living with a mental health challenge, you recognize this right away. If you want to be supportive to others who are living with mental health challenges, I want you to be aware of this idea that as part of concealment culture, there's this expectation that in order for you to have a mental illness, you have to have some sort of visible signs. And we can say that that's kind of because of the way Hollywood or pop culture has given us a tainted view of mental health. And that's true. But those things are also perpetuated by things we were believing before we ever saw it on a TV or movie screen. And, you know, you think of cartoonish things, people with very visible tics and oscillating, frenetic gestures, the so-called crazy person, shifting eyes and really, really, really frenetic physical behavior. And that's called the crazy person. And someone expects you to look like that, and that means, oh, you have a mental health issue. So that if you're sitting there in your chair, you're not crying in the corner, you're not seemingly moving without ability to have any physical control, then you must not really have any real problems. That's a real attitude that people can falsely have, that you need to be showing some sort of consistent outward injuries to or behavior. One of the things that I want to draw our attention to about that is that concealment culture isn't just about you woke up today and you automatically are going to hide what's going on in your mind. Because we don't educate on mental health, it's very often that people don't even know that they might be dealing with something that is a mental health challenge. More importantly, it's not so much that people just decide one day that they're going to hide what's going on. We live in a society where we watch other people have bad experiences with letting their mental health issues be known, so we can see someone else having an issue, and that makes us stay silent about our own issues because we don't want to deal with, if we see someone else having a problem with they tell them they're depressed, and we see that they get treated weirdly or in a way that we don't like, that just makes it easier for us to want to stay silent because we don't want to follow in the same experiences that they did. Concealment culture is a term that we use because it's not something that you just happens overnight, but it's reinforced by not challenging stigmas, not being able to appreciate just how much control and power we have to shape each other's attitudes about mental health. And that sounds like a dark thing to say, but the cool thing is, this also means that we have tremendous amount of power to change the conversation on mental health. There's going to be things that are about institutional things that got to change. We've got to change big policies, legislature, rules of the way schools or companies do business. But the biggest, most powerful and immediate changes we can be doing can also happen by a willingness of us using our voices and us being able to reach out peer to peer. We can be making dynamic, revolutionary changes just by each one of us individually deciding that we're going to reject and break away from stigmatized behavior. And we're going to reject concealment culture. And that's a matter of getting educated and being able to adopt the right practices to embrace what we call proactive prevention, which is our sort of approach to how we believe we can change the conversation on mental health. There's so many great organizations doing a lot in terms of working towards prevention and supporting people living with mental health challenges, and the network's role in all this. is to consolidate all of our forces to move in the direction of not just dealing with the problems of today, but trying to set in motion a process in which, moving down the road, we'll be able to reduce high risk and be able to disrupt crisis over the long haul. And we wouldn't have to just keep waiting for someone to show up in crisis and then we treat them. Because the best resources we have right now oftentimes can only respond when someone is unable to conceal their mental health challenges. And there's very little resources available for someone who isn't at a stage where their life may be at risk or their quality of life is severely impacted. And that actually is kind of the preface for what I'm sort of talking about today. In media recently, and there's always mental health stories that you can pick from and engage with, but coming into today, there were some interesting stories that sort of stood out to me when I talk about concealment culture and the masks we wear and things like that, that I thought would be interesting to riff on. And one of them is from a world that you will, the more and more you see of me, you're going to just have to sort of deal with it, get used to, which is from the world of pro wrestling. There's a A&E series called Dark Side of the Ring that likes to do, from an outsider's perspective, stories in the pro wrestling universe. And most recently, they did an episode on an individual who in the ring goes by Luna Vachon, and their real life name is Gertrude Elizabeth Vachon, but on stage they're known as Luna. And if you know anything about pro wrestling, or even vaguely, just superficially, you kind of, you think of pro wrestling and you think of certain performers, your Stone Cold, The Rock, John Cena, Hulk Hogan, things like that. You can understand that a lot of the fine science of pro wrestling is about somebody off the street crafts a character that sort of is this larger than life being in front of a camera. And it requires a high degree of athletic precision and a high degree of sort of performative input to be successful in pro wrestling. The most successful people in the industry, it's said by experts, and this is probably true, is that the most successful people in pro wrestling are individuals who take some fragment or piece of their real personality and they turn the volume all the way up to 10. And Luna was a very well-respected athlete who started in the 80s and came to fame and prominence in what was formerly the WWF, now WWE, through the 90s, and was a rarity for being what's called a worker, a real solid worker, not someone who was there. Typically, women in wrestling you might describe as rather problematic historically, but we're seen as, ring valets and individuals who were like eye candy treatment secondaries. And it would be a long time before they would be perceived and presented as athletes who deserved athletic respect and things like that. And Luna was someone who, in an era in pro wrestling where women performers were not treated as athletes, but were seen as eye candy and used as models and things like that, was one of the rare individuals who was physically involved and was regarded as an athlete and worker. And the documentary follows the legacy of Luna Vachon and her great innovations and contributions to the industry. But it unfortunately also follows a story about Luna was born in 1962 and likely had an untimely, tomorrow wasn't promised to anyone, but ultimately it can be viewed as an untimely passing in 2010 that was attributed to a drug overdose. And that doesn't encompass the total life and contributions of Luna Vachon, who was inspiring to people, who provided thousands upon thousands of individuals with entertainment and memorable moments to millions. But why I highlight the story is because the overall narrative is about, you had this individual who created this very demonic and brutal and aggressive, and you can see the sort of images in the box here. The character that you saw on TV was this very aggressive, hell-raising badass who was all about kicking ass and taking names. Used a really, really husky, one might say unfeminine voice, which again was sort of breaking the mold of how women were presented at the time of her sort of peak, and really brought out a unique niche for herself. And this very strong, very strong individual was shown to be, and I don't know if I'm having a little bit of technical difficulties here. We'll see if I can't get it fixed. Give me a second. Give me 1 second here. I think I'm having a little connection issue. Okay, so hopefully this is going to be better. Okay, so let's see. 1 second here. All right. So I think my connection went out. So I'm just going to pick up where I left off there. So Luna Vachon was presented as this sort of really tough, badass, kick-ass type person. And why I bring that up is because the documentary obviously follows how the individual behind the on-camera presentation was someone who went through a lot of tumult and trouble. They had a very, very disruptive young life. Luna's biological father died by suicide. There was a very dysfunctional domestic situation. And Luna would be like so many other Americans and individuals across the planet would experience a late stage diagnosis for bipolar disorder, which she lived with undiagnosed throughout her teens and 20s and early 30s, and along the way picked up a reliance on different substances, primarily the pill form, that sort of coped and masked what her undiagnosed challenges were. And there's not a lot of an expose on, Luna doesn't have any sort of like documentary interviews or anything where she's able to really tell her side of the story. And so we're not gonna like go too much into it. But if you watch the Dark Side of the Ring episode, people who were around her and knew her very closely do talk about the way that she struggled. And the part I want to bring up, just with all due respect to not sort of psychoanalyzing Luna, is the one thing that was an absolute takeaway is the way that she concealed her mental health challenges, both professionally and even to her close friends. And that's the thing we want to talk about here, is that Luna was in a very intensive on-camera role for the majority of her active career, in front of millions of people at a time when, she was a star and a celebrity in that world, and to a larger degree. And her personal life, she was surrounded by people who were both in the industry with her. So she spent a lot of time around these individuals, and she concealed what were undiagnosed issues. And there's a longer story to be told about people living with undiagnosed mental health challenges. That's something that I think we can probably spend a whole day on, or multiple days on, if we wanted to. Just alone talking about how people will spend years and years and years living undiagnosed and thinking that their mental health challenges are entirely their fault, not realizing that it's mental health challenges, right? But I bring it up because one thing we need to understand is that Luna lived in a profession where it was the intention to present something, sort of synthetic to the world, an expert at sort of creating an ongoing character, more so than just being an actor or someone on like a Broadway stage. So it wasn't entirely complicated for her to conceal her mental health challenges, even if she didn't necessarily recognize a diagnosis for them or put her finger on them. And this is a person who's regarded by a lot of people as being strong and having to be a successful pro wrestler requires a high degree of discipline in a lot of ways, not just a physical durability, but a sort of to keep your motivation going. You've got to have a certain willpower and resilience, innate resilience about it. And like any other sport, no one is immune to mental health challenges. And the thing that I want to draw in here is the fact that it was absolutely essential for Luna to let people think that she was normal, that she was all right. And when it comes to living with an undiagnosed illness, you can start to blame yourself if the solutions and things you try to do to make yourself feel normal, feel better, be functioning, aren't working. And here you have someone who had a high rate of travel. Pro wrestlers, especially in the era that Luna was in, were on the road 200 plus days a week, lots of travel, different time zones, so much inconsistency and instability, and she's still able to sort of manage and function. And as we would learn through the documentary, function using substances to help support that. It's hard to really be able to appreciate just the level of focus and the intensity that someone would have to apply to be able to sort of keep a game face on, a mask on, to conceal whatever was going on, while also dealing with such a high intense and high stress work environment. Take that example and then transfer it over into anyone else's life. There are millions and millions of individuals across the country who regardless of what their work looks like, whether it's physical manual labor or you're sitting in a chair in a cubicle, there are scores and scores of people who, because we don't normalize mental health discussions, will find themselves living with mental health challenges that they haven't given themselves the grace to get diagnosed or to see clinicians about, haven't even begun those conversations, that they just think there's something wrong with them, that they didn't get enough sleep, that the reason that they're suffering from low energy or have invasive thoughts because maybe they were traumatized, having a psychological injury, it was something that they're just supposed to get over or just deal with it. And they may turn to substances to sort of build a crutch, whether it's alcohol, marijuana, pills, exercise, any sorts of different valves that they use to try and compensate to make themselves feel better. But they're not having a conversation that could dramatically impact their lives. But they're still going out day to day to day, trying to be very much high functioning at something. And on the face of it, they can be described as being a productive human being. Somebody could say, well, they're happy or a positive minded person. But inside, when they're alone, they could be going through hell. This is a very common thing we see with people who take surveys after getting diagnosed, is that they spent a lot of time putting on a game face. And there's something to be said for the dichotomy of pro wrestling is all about creating a character that's larger than life. And if we take this into our day-to-day lives, for people living with a mental health challenge, you spend a lot of time constructing a persona that's normal, that doesn't have problems. If you feel stigmatized and if you feel compelled to stay silent about your mental health, you spend a lot of time and energy concealing it. But by concealing it, the way that looks is you've put on a persona of normalcy, that there isn't anything wrong with you. You underplay signs and symptoms. If it's a mental health challenge that impacts you going out socially, going out with friends and family and whatever, if it's a matter that impacts you physically in a way that it can make it hard to be intimate with a partner, it can be hard to communicate consistently with friends in a social manner. You've come up and constructed all sorts of different dynamics and explanations and little finesse games to explain why you're not showing up to this thing, or why you're unable to talk about that thing, or you're just not feeling like hooking up tonight. And you see, I'm drawing a huge spectrum of ways mental health impacts our quality of life, from physical to just psychological and communication-wise. And even if you're not necessarily jumping through the hoops of normalcy for other people, you may be just in the privacy of your own mind and your own residence. You may be trying to pretend to yourself or convince yourself that you're sitting in that normal box. And that can be because you grew up being told that mental health challenges are for weak people, or that there's a gender link to mental health challenges, that real men don't cry, or that there's a cultural context that you grew up in an Italian family and Italians don't have mental health challenges. Okay. All of them are falsehoods, and normal is just a setting on a washing machine. But here we are. We know as the fact that there are millions upon millions of individuals who go through these sort of acts of concealment, and they may not even be aware that there could be a road to a better, because they themselves have never been provided with information or opportunities to look down paths of mental health supports and resources. Being proactive is about trying to build those bridges and bring that light to people. And Luna Vachon's story ends in a sort of sad way, because it's believed that her reliance on certain substances as a coping mechanism could have been prevented or addressed. That going through drug rehab, which was provided to her at one point, was not. It was helpful, but may not have been the comprehensive resources that she needed. Getting the body clean of a substance for a moment doesn't necessarily remove other issues when it comes to mental health. And this brings us, if you look at the very first episode of Raising the Visibility, we met with the wonderful folks of Live Lolly, which work to combat substance reliances and create healthy outcomes for people who are struggling with substance dependencies. And it was a natural conversation to have, because through research, we're able to see that there is a building likeliness of the correlation between people who will turn to and build a dependency on substances and untreated or undertreated mental health challenges. That as you start to see people who are going through a reliance on substance use, oftentimes getting them so-called clean of the drugs won't necessarily guarantee they'll be able to resist finding their way back to substance use, if they also aren't being able to connect with mental health supports as well, because there's other underlying issues that, even when sober, still disrupt their quality of life. So that's one way to look at it, is the sort of the game faces that we put on. And talking about Luna, who was a public figure in a way, in front of millions and millions of people's eyes and live audiences. There was another story, a documentary, incidentally enough, that came out recently in the last 2 weeks about another kind of public figure who, through the documentary, revealed that they put on a game face. And I thought it was really interesting, the sort of dichotomy. And that was the Paris Hilton documentary that came out. And for a certain age and demographic, you hear the name and it's synonymous with a number of maybe ideas and attitudes that you had that were reinforced not just by media or journalism, but by Paris Hilton herself, who was a socialite individual who was part of the very earliest era of our modern sort of reality TV concept of, someone who was just sort of being a character for reality TV without necessarily coming from a sports world or being an actor or being, they were known, and so therefore they got a TV deal or they got attention because they were known. And not dancing, we're not dancing around anything. We're not dancing around anything when we say that Paris was treated as sort of like a punchline. And there were journalists who would sort of go along the lines of like, it's the end of society. Paris Hilton's fame is a bad influence for kids and da-da-da-da. And there's actually been Paris Hilton has been sort of interchanged with other types of high-profile socialite types since her fame. That's all good and well. And as we learn through these documentaries that you start to see a picture that's beyond the public image, if people remember the sort of like the documentaries around Britney Spears and other, especially high-profile female individuals, women who are in the public spotlight, and they really get treated pretty nastily. And it gets piled on early, but then 2, 3, 5, 10 years later, you do a retrospective and you look at the person as a human being and not just as like a conversation topic. And people start like, oh man, we really did treat them like shit. And there's a whole like underlying sexism to it. This whole like tradition of these socialites being sort of called, and their promiscuities put into question, called sluts, all these kind of different things. Paris Hilton's documentary, of course, follows all of that and brings it all to bear. She was called a million different things, treated a million different ways, and a lot of it was very negative and critical. And because it's a documentary, Paris does get the agency to speak and sort of share her story, unlike we didn't get that chance with Luna. And Paris reveals that she'd experienced an intensive amount of traumatic, psychologically injurious experiences as a youth and a teen. She'd been sent away to sort of a type of very intensive disciplinary camp type thing. She had a number of physically abusive boyfriends as well. And for all the intensive, high-profile paparazzi-style coverage of Paris Hilton, I certainly can speak to, those stories never, ever came out. And Paris talks about how she worked very hard to not reveal, especially her experiences at this sleepaway youth camp. And she goes on to talk about how the harm and the abuse and the behavior she had at these disciplinary camps where she was hauled off to against her will, and it was like a high-end juvenile detention thing, shaped a lot of her insecurities, created potential forms of depression. And the documentary focuses on how Paris consciously pushed and perpetuated this sort of inflammable, impervious to criticism, Barbie-esque, ditzy, she doesn't give a shit kind of persona. And it became a defense mechanism. And by her own words, she describes it as a phase. And you can see how that became something that really clicked in my head as I was just watching the Dark Side of the Ring thing, and then here watching Paris Hilton, who was never given the benefit of the doubt or any sort of sympathetic treatment at the sort of peak of her fame and celebrity, that she could never have any problems or issues. And then in the documentary, she, of course, talks about and affirms the fact that she felt that no one would ever believe or give her credit or validate her experiences. And she didn't want to or risk people, exposing her how she was feeling. And so we see it once again, this really, really complex, conscious decision to create a whole concealment mask, a whole game face. And for Paris and the situation that she was in, and granted, it's not like everyone's going to get offered a reality TV show or anything like that, but taking advantage of these things, she still felt compelled to put on a game face and a mask. And we know, celebrities, they put on some sort of public show for us anyway, and that's not who they truly are. But the thing I just want to draw out from the intersection with Paris and Luna here is the fact that a real human being going through trauma who does have financial access to get treatment and this and the other, it was a matter of safety. By her words, it was a matter of safety to put on a game face that still got pilloried and criticized and insulted and degraded. And somehow that game face was still safer than exploring the trauma and negative self-thoughts and psychological injuries that she endured from the early adolescent childhood experiences all the way through living with her abusive experiences inside of romantic relationships. And just where there's this underscore in Luna's experience about substance reliance and drug use, people who are living with mental health challenges can also find themselves interrelated in really dysfunctional romantic relationships too. Abusive individuals themselves, what makes an abusive individual can be any number of things. But people who are victims of abusers don't bring it on themselves. They don't ask for it. But what you find are the people who are living with their own mental health challenges, oftentimes when they experience abusive partners, they gaslight themselves and they sort of diminish their own self-worth. And abusive people will take advantage of that, like predators, the predators that they are. And there's just a really sad and unfortunate consistency that we often find that people who become targets of abusive predators are people who are also living with undertreated and untreated mental health challenges prior to the abuse ever beginning. And because they spend a lot of time in concealment, an abusive predator takes advantage of that. And they find a ways to manipulate and hyper sort of intensify people's own mental health challenges so that when it comes to feelings of inferiority, of lacking self-worth, of low self-confidence, all these kind of things that a predatory person can sort of expose, when you're living with a mental health challenge, those things become different sorts of elements of keeping you in that relationship. And that's such a tragic outcome of untreated mental health challenges, the fact that you find yourself almost helpless. And when you speak with survivors of domestic abuse, whether it's in a marriage or dating relationship of any age and of any gender dynamic, whether it's two individuals who identify as male, two individuals who identify as female, or male on male, or female on male, or male on female, you see this correlation between an abuser who is very actively preying on someone's mental health, along with preying on them physically as well. And when we talk about concealment culture, and again, reinforcing this idea of a lack of education about our mental health and awareness of signs and symptoms and resources, it becomes part of this really terrifying scenario in that we could be disrupting the risk of abusive predators the more we're able to empower people to address their own mental health. Because it's one of these things where if someone is of an abusive nature, being able to recognize those behavior traits in them and disrupt them and engage them at a young, early age means that we're not having predatory people roam around. Instead of it being a conversation where we're just telling people, well, here's how you protect yourself against an abuser, which unfortunately is a conversation people think is the only one to have. But proactive education on mental health doesn't just work for people who could be living with a challenge. Proactive education on mental health can also be something where a community can begin to recognize predatory people and abusive people, and we can disrupt their ability to function. And so it doesn't have to just be a one-sided conversation of here's how you don't end up in an abusive relationship. That's a good conversation to have, but probably an even more effective conversation and an even more essential conversation that we're not having is how do we recognize abusive and predatory people, and how do we engage and disrupt and extract them or their behavior from harming other people. So Paris Hilton's documentary also comes at a different angle in that all of the sort of pop cultural dogpiling that was done on her, there's this huge gender linking to it. And in later conversations, we're going to be talking about and doing some interviews and panels with people talking about mental health and the intersections within gender identity and sexual orientation. Because remember what I said, stigmas are social and cultural factors, right? And how we respond to different people's mental health and how we respond to people themselves, unfortunately, is largely influenced by their gender and their identity, their gender identity and their sexual orientation, their cultural backgrounds, ethnic, spiritual, philosophical. All these things play into how we validate people's mental health and validate them as human beings. And as another sort of side note of topics we're going to have longer discussions about down the road, the Paris Hilton documentary is a place where she fits a category of people where there isn't going to be a lot of public sympathy. That's just a fact. There's no fancy way to dance around it. But someone who's financially well off and affluent is not going to be given the benefit of the doubt or the dignity of the individualism that we might look at for certain types of people who have less materially. And I say certain types because communities and societies, not just American, but communities and societies at large also categorize and create a hierarchy of validation for low-income people and people with less material means. And that's part of the stigmas too. There's a whole stigma that says that some people are impoverished because of their own fault. And that will then also piggyback into people's mental health challenges are their own fault. Because that's how we do a lot of these things when it comes to our challenges, is we validate them on qualifiers. And Paris brings up the other end of this whole game face thing where this is someone who wouldn't get any sort of major sympathy traditionally. And this documentary still may not do anything to change someone's view of her or even validate their mental health. They may look at him like, oh, poor kid, You got millions and bajillions of dollars. You should have just seen a therapist and gotten over it. But it wasn't the money that makes somebody say get over it. It's there's too many people in our society who still grow up and are reinforced with the false belief that mental health is something that we 100% control. And that's part of stigmas. That's part of what reinforces concealment culture, is this belief that you could have personally inherited, that you're supposed to be able to just deal with things when it comes to your thoughts, feelings, and emotions. And that brings me up to another thing that we saw recently this past week, and it's from the world of sports, because talking about these qualifiers and validating mental health, this sort of like piggybacks right into the next level here. Dallas Cowboys quarterback, Dak Prescott, was very correctly and rightly lauded for being very open about his brother's death by suicide last year. His brother, Jace Prescott, died by suicide at the age of 31 in April of 2020. And recently, a photo or a number of photos were published in which people noticed that on Dak's left, and I might also be right, wristbands, he writes the phrase "ask for help." Now, Dak, in the aftermath of his brother's passing, started a faith-based, I shouldn't say faith-based, Dak's faith inspired him to start a foundation to combat suicide and mental health challenges in youth particularly, but it's kind of like a universal thing. But ask for help, because his uniform number is 4. So Ask for Help Foundation is Dak Prescott's group to push to champion mental health and stop the epidemic of youth suicide. That's the byline on it. But I want to draw back in on this thing about him putting ask for help on his wristbands. So Dak did that because, yes, he's got a foundation. You can Google it, look it up, and all that good stuff, and he talks about it. And there's even national and international commercials with the NFL talking about embracing mental health. But Dak puts the ask for help because he knows that he's a high visibility person. He knows every waking move on the field is going to be monitored and analyzed. And he knows that putting that message on his game gear is a powerful tool to force and put the conversation right in people's faces. And being prescriptive, using our, as a mental health, supporting the suicide prevention as an organization, we would call this raising the visibility. But putting this in a public forum, putting it on the wristband like that, is also a way of breaking stigma, because it's doing something that we would describe as normalizing the conversation. Dak isn't just doing this when it's September, which is generally called Suicide Prevention Month. He's not doing it just in May, which is considered Mental Health Month. And there's days for mental health awareness or breaking mental health stigmas. October 10th is one of those days. Dak isn't just doing this on any one particular day. He does this every single one of his game days, which are Sundays in the NFL, if you didn't know. And when we think about the whole idea of game face and masks, Dak didn't tell too much in the day-to-day details of the passing of his younger brother. But older brother. But Dak did elaborate on the fact that his brother's passing was a surprise. He mentioned that Dak's mother passing away from colon cancer right before his brother Jace died by suicide could have had an effect on there. Did have an effect, but Dak didn't say that was the only reason. Dak has been on record as also, though, talking about that Jace, who was a football player himself, a high-performing football player himself, like a lot of other men, sort of put on a game face and was a sort of the boys don't cry mentality. Grown up in their background, there was a belief about being able to tough it out and deal with it. And so Jace's mental health challenges were dealt with, according to Dak, largely dealt with concealed even from Dak. That Jace didn't really talk about any of it. He concealed it. And if you remember what I talked about right at the top of the show, this belief of concealing our mental challenges as a mode of safety and security. And you see this running thread I'm building here from Luna to Paris Hilton to this story. And Luna never got a chance to tell her story and break her silence. Paris is breaking that silence and started an organization dedicated to confronting these like sleepaway schools that were so traumatic to her experiences. And Dak is a survivor of loss, and like Paris has begun an organization, and he's targeting largely in the whole realm where, you know, there's resources and therapy sessions. Dak is really focused on challenging the silence among especially young boys and their mental health. That's where he asks for help, is a role that he sees he can be a major role in. And he's not the only one in the NFL. In fact, Dak's Ask for Help organization just teamed with a group that was built by a football player from the Oakland Raiders who started his own organization called the Defensive Line. And I think there's a video. I want to pull the audio up before I go further. We'll pull the video and audio up for this Defensive Line organization because this individual, you're going to see his name come up and all that. This individual just had this press conference this past weekend. And his name's Solomon Thomas. And we're just going to run a little bit of this video here from his press conference this past Sunday first before I jump into things. Make sure it's audible. So what you're seeing is that Solomon is talking about for every sack, he's a defensive player. So for every time he gets a sack, he's going to donate $8,000 to his foundation, the Defensive Line Foundation. To his foundation, the Defensive Line Foundation. And his foundation, the Defensive Line Foundation, is again another group dedicated to mental health, but also in the vein of supporting with a focus on sort of breaking the stigma, particularly among young men and boys, on mental health. Because of the belief that the silence perpetuated by masculinity and perpetuated by false beliefs and sort of boys don't cry is a leading cause of mental health challenges become untreated and unaddressed in their own background. And so I think we can see where I'm going with that is that, remember what I said at the very top here in talking about concealment culture, stigma isn't just a buzzword, and we talk about this idea of social and cultural factors. When it comes to suicide rates, we know that men have the highest rates of completion, women will have the highest rates of attempts, according to the CDC. And one of the reasons that men will be attributed with having higher rates of suicide completions is typically methodology, the use of firearms, for instance, as opposed to poisoning or asphyxiation. But suicide has no prejudice. It impacts all ages, all genders, all ethnicities, all economic levels. But something that we see sort of universally here is that when it comes to people dealing with their mental challenges, we have a whole bunch of resources that are set up that can really only engage someone at the point of crisis. Okay. And when crisis comes, can be someone is in the very moment at risk of harming themselves. To paint a picture without being disrespectful, they're on the ledge. Okay. But that's not the only form of crisis. Crisis has that feature that they're right in the very immediate. But crisis can also be they're unable to hide their mental health challenges anymore. Remember what I said at the start of the episode, that if somebody feels their job could be threatened, or an intimate or platonic or social relationship could be destabilized, or their school experience, or any other number of scenarios, anything where their quality of life could be severely impacted if their mental challenges are exposed or revealed, that becomes a crisis for them. That becomes a moment where their mental challenges reach a very, very, very intense and almost unmanageable level for them. That's crisis. And the really, really, really frustrating thing when it comes to suicide prevention and mental health care anywhere in the globe, but let's talk about America specifically for a moment, is that our very best resources, when we think of things like mental health first aid, are designed to really target when people enter a state of crisis. But we don't have a lot of tools or resources designed to disrupt escalating to a point of crisis. And so if people aren't in the stage of crisis, and instead they're on this sort of like escalating path, we also don't have a lot of tools that identify or highlight the onset. When I say tools, I mean professional tools might exist, but they're not embedded in schools or places that aren't necessarily, even a social worker or clinician isn't necessarily academically trained to have a private practice where they're expecting someone to engage with them when their mental health challenges are in the earliest stages, okay? Because in the earliest stages, your mental health challenges may not be disrupting your quality of life at all. They're just things you might be aware of, but you don't have a name for it. You don't know that you don't know what these symptoms are called. They're just things that bother you. But we don't even really recognize what onset looks like either. So you have this whole system of prevention and awareness that's really kind of just focused on the crisis stage, okay? Because that's the most visible, and there are signs that are consistent with being alerted and alarmed to that people need help. But then if you look at the graphic that's, right here, there's this whole other level of onset and escalation that we really don't deal with. And there's the whole world of like wellness, and we got to be careful. Self-care is a real thing, but self-care is even being kind of hijacked by consumerism, that it's not being taken for what it can be seen as preventative and maintenance, mental health maintenance, but that self-care is being reduced to it's just it's just getting a massage and a bath bomb and listening to some comforting music and a little bit of relaxation, as if you're just going on a weekend break or something. But self-care should be a regimen of things that you're doing consistently to monitor and process stressors and issues in your mental health, so that you can be aware if you experience something that requires professional support, something that maxes out your ability to deal with it. But all of that's just, there is no set rhythm for that right now in the way that we educate and train our professionals and our advocates and our support people on mental health. Right now, all the resources and energy is dedicated in that crisis stage. And the reason I wanted to tie these three experiences together is because DAC represents what could be a proactive concept, in that asking for help is at least moving further by trying to talk to the individual themselves. And organizations like the Defensive Line and Ask for Help are dedicated to trying to get people to talk about their mental health before it starts to really harm their lives. And the three people I talked about were all individuals who found high profile levels of success. They had financial access or opportunities that many individuals may struggle with, but they still weren't able to shake needing to put on a mask and to conceal their mental health challenges. And if the best case scenario is you having money and access to those financial resources, and it's still hard to be able to confront our mental health, then I think you should be able to give yourself the benefit of the doubt. And we need to extend that olive branch to every other human being on the planet about just how unbelievably tough being able to be open and upfront about your mental health really is. It's likely terrifying. When we really get at it, somebody might be able to wrap their heads around being able to say, well, I'm not feeling good today. But that's not the same thing as being able to actively disclose your general functionality, mental health functionality on a day-to-day basis, not to just any random person, but to the people you love and care about and who care about you. And being able to have open discussions with trusted individuals is an essential part of our well-being. So when we think about this idea of onset to crisis, when we talk about concealment culture, its ultimate, biggest, concrete, most visible detriment is that it creates this huge gap. This gap between the moment and points at which mental challenges begin to onset for us, whether it's a trauma or it's a genetic-based diagnosis with illness, and the point at which resources are able to engage you. And you can look anywhere in the spectrum of mental health that it's primarily focused on the crisis stage. And the whole idea behind proactive prevention and what we're trying to do with building these coalitions and what we're trying to do by normalizing mental health discussions is we are trying to close the gap between onset and intervention. Right now, you might see that graphic that says onset and crisis. And that's to illustrate that whole line between onset and crisis is a line that's experienced in a stigmatized silence. People doing any number of things, whether it's using substances to conceal or to manage and cope, whether it's personally dismissing, minimizing, or outwardly pretending like you don't have problems, that you fit and you comply with whatever illusion of normalcy is. That line between onset and crisis is the line that escalates to harm. That line, that gap, is the lethal reality inside of mental health. Having clinical depression, bipolar disorder, being traumatized does not, I repeat, does not mean self-harm is inevitable. But the way that we currently exist, we have a system that continually perpetuates underserving and undertreating our mental health challenges, so that it's very likely that people can enter or escalate to a stage of crisis if they have a type of condition that can escalate that way. So when you're living with a mental health challenge and you get the proper tools and resources, it's oftentimes in spite of the reality around us and not because of the systems in front of us. And that doesn't dismiss the hundreds and thousands of individuals who are dedicated to supporting mental health care, from clinicians, be it therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, inpatient and outpatient services from the hospital level to the clinicians inside of those support systems, to family members and friends who want to be supportive, community systems inside of schools, whether it's school counselors and guidance, support groups, all these different types of individuals and associations, organizations, and professionals who really, really want the best outcome for you to stay alive, to stay healthy, to stay functioning and positive. And we still have this massive gap that all of us can close. We can close the gap between onset and intervention. And on that graphic, we can replace the crisis with onset to effective treatment and support. And the most exciting thing about all this is that, as I said at the very start, it doesn't ask for some sort of magic wand or some sort of miracle, one day only, everyone hold hands across the world type of thing. It requires a willingness to validate that mental health is real. It requires a recognition that we can be doing more for mental health supports, treatments, and interventions than we currently are. It means respecting the current institutions and organizations that are out there, but also recognizing that we need to innovate and we need to continue to progress. And ultimately, that comes to why we make the case and are able to consistently affirm it, that proactive prevention is the next step. Where we've gone right now, we're trying to excel at crisis intervention. And we believe that the best crisis intervention that we can perform, especially into the 21st century, is moving to a proactive mindset, creating policies that the individual can utilize for self-care and early recognition, creating policies and education and trainings so that community spaces like a school, a library, even a place of business, a family can become aware and recognize signs and symptoms in others and be supportive and sensitive to someone living with a mental health challenge. And that this mindset can also develop policies to reform or enhance institutions to be able to change so that they're providing services and systems that don't stigmatize, harm, or denigrate someone with a mental health challenge. That's the goal and that's our hope. And tonight, I'm glad you were able to join me as we sort of follow through. We were just sort of talking about these three stories that sort of just came up in the media all at once aren't going to be the only mental health stories that ever come up, right? But time and time again, you're going to notice that a lot of these stories call on people sort of breaking out of their silence or their reactive stories, people who are going through something and they finally reached out for help. Success for us, it is our hope, is that we're able to create education and practices where the success story isn't talking someone down from crisis, but that someone was able to engage supports, either personal care or were able to escalate to professional supports at the earliest moment that they recognized something was going on with their mental health that seemed to miss, and they didn't feel ashamed to connect with resources, whether it's a youth connecting with their parents and that parents being a bridge, that parent or guardian being a bridge to professional resources, or an adult realizing that they're going through something or experiencing something and they don't feel ashamed or embarrassed to reach out before it causes any further negative impact on their lives. Mental health is a normal and natural state of our realities, and you deserve the wellness that anyone else might expect from our physiological injuries. And the Hope for Us Network is dedicated to building that change, and together we can really make that difference. And that's why we continually going to be encouraging you all to join us. This tonight was kind of just a little quick conversation, and I'm glad you could join me. I will be expecting to have guests on from time to time and doing a few other things. Like I said, raising the visibility is focused on exploring mental health at social and cultural intersections. So we were kind of just sort of riffing today. As we're winding down tonight, I wanted to let you know a little bit about other things going on with the network. Next week, we've got a great little bit of fun on Wednesday, the 27th, kicking off in the evening. We're going to be having a Halloween stream, a Hallow stream, if you will. Join us we've got some digital costume parties, some pumpkin carving, some games and trivia. The whole network family is going to be on camera, or at least a few of us from different places. We'll even have some music and some other hijinks. And we're just doing a little early Halloween festivities, scaring away stigma together. The fun's going to be kicking off somewhere around 7 p.m., if I'm not mistaken. And, of course, you'll be tuning in here on our Twitch channel. And next week, we'll also be having our regular programming, our Tuesday and Thursday 7 p.m. and 6:30 episodes will be airing. If you check the Twitch schedule, you'll see what's coming up each week. And like I said before, if you can, if possible, don't forget to subscribe or use your Amazon Prime donation subscription. And if you're curious about resources or anything like that, you can always click !resources, !socials, !donate, !vods in the chat if you want to get any of those things, resources, information, how to donate, how to follow our socials. And I want to, on behalf of the Hope for Us Network, I want to thank our production team, Lone Star, and everyone for getting me set up, working the fancy little vids we had running. Apologies for the little tech delivery. I'm going to probably have to up my Wi-Fi game or get a landline. I'll figure that out. But I want to thank you all for this second episode of Raising the Visibility as we continue to enhance and grow our programming. I'm honored that you were able to make time for me tonight. So with that, I hope you all have a wonderful evening and take care of yourselves. Be well.